Hey guys, we've got an interesting episode today. In front of me I've got a mead that I'm working on. This is made from about 3 parts water to 1 part local honey. It started at about 25% sugar with that ratio, and everything is going really smooth. But if you've ever worked with honey before, made a mead, you might have found that it can really be a struggle to ferment. It can create all sorts of hydrogen sulfide, stinky, rotten egg smell, or it can just outright stall on you. So today I'm going to talk about why that can happen and what you can do to make sure that doesn't happen to you when making a mead. This mead is going to go into a Pyment. So a Pyment is a mead wine blend. It's a grape-based wine and a honey-based mead. I might actually end up bottling a 375 milliliter or 2 separate, but for the most part it's a little experimental batch to see how this will go. The wine I'm going to pair with is going to be a Traminette. This little fermenter is actually working really nice. I don't normally ferment in this small of a batch, but I'm using one of these little serving glass containers, and like I said, it works as a really nice little fermenter. Now let's talk about why people always have so much trouble when fermenting a mead. If you're going to ferment a wine, what you're often going to do is balance your acids before you even get started. And going into a mead, you might be tempted to do the same thing, but I would suggest to go at it a little bit differently. Honey has virtually no natural pH buffers, unlike a grape-based wine. So the pH of this particular mead started out at about 4.7, which you'd think, wow, that's maybe a little bit, high. Maybe you want to add a little bit of acid. Well, because there's no pH buffers, once that yeast started fermenting, it started creating some organic acids, and that pH dove really quickly. And in the span of about 2 days, this mead dropped to about a pH of 3.25. Now 3.25 is still a pretty safe place to be if you're fermenting with wine yeast, but you can see how that could cause you some trouble if you're starting at a little bit of a lower pH than what I started at. So if you started a pH of anywhere probably in like 3.6, 3.7 or lower, you're going to want to actually make a subtle adjustment upwards. You're going to want to neutralize some of those acids just so you don't run away to a point where that yeast doesn't like to ferment. Once you get below something like 3.0, 2.9, it can create some real struggles for that yeast. So the way you're going to adjust your pH is going to be with potassium carbonate. You can add a little bit of potassium carbonate just to get that pH up to 3.7, and you're going to want to watch it really closely, like every maybe 12 hours once that fermentation starts, so that it doesn't just run right down to 2.5 or something and stall that fermentation out. So you want to be ready with that potassium carbonate until you're probably 5 or 6 days into the fermentation. And if you do want to make any acid adjustments for taste, you're going to want to make those adjustments after fermentation's complete. In this case, I'll probably adjust with tartaric acid because I'm making a wine blend, a Pyment. And tartaric acid is the natural acid of grapes. It's the predominant natural acid of grapes. The other issue you're going to have with a honey mead like this is that there's virtually no nitrogen available for that yeast. So it's like trying to grow a garden in soil with no nitrogen. Those plants just aren't going to be happy. Well, in the same way, your yeasts are not going to be happy without available nitrogen. And the way we measure nitrogen for a fermentation, well, it's really difficult to measure at home, but the units you're going to use are yeast assimilable nitrogen, so YAN. And a healthy fermentation, you really want a number like 200 to 300 parts per million. We can assume that by the time I've diluted this 3 to 1, we're probably at something like 5 parts per million, which is severely deficient. So if you read the instructions on your yeast nutrient, which is going to be your source of nitrogen, it's going to tell you something like 3/4 of a gram per, I don't even know actually, let me see here. Yeah, so it tells you something like 1/2 to 3/4 of a gram per gallon of DAP. So this is pretty much the most potent source of nitrogen that you're going to add. But the reality is you're going to need to add a lot more than that, because you want to get that level up to at least a threshold where it is at the bottom of adequate. And then from there you can start using more sophisticated nutrients like Ferment K. So when adding diammonium phosphate to bring your nitrogen up, 1 gram to a liter of wine is going to add about 212 parts per million of YAN. And we're looking for a minimum of somewhere about 150 before we want to start adding things like Ferment K. So for instance, this 1.5 gallons is roughly 6 liters. We would take 150 divided by 212 times 6 liters, and that would tell us how much DAP to add before we start moving into our Ferment K. Now, this particular mead, I'm going to treat a little bit different than some mead makers will. A lot of times they'll stagger that Ferment K addition. You might add a little bit at the start, and then you might add a little bit more at, after about 1/3 of those sugars are consumed. Well, I added everything at the front end, and I'm only shooting for about 200 parts per million. And what I'm going to do with this mead is I'm going to intentionally stall it. I'm going to cold crash it at about 5% sugar. That's going to leave it a little bit of residual sugar, and it's going to be a really honey forward mead, which by itself might be pretty good, but also when mixed with that Pyment, it's probably going to contribute something really kind of floral to that mix. So as if those issues weren't enough of a struggle for your yeast, it actually goes even farther than that. Let's talk about the sugars in honey. So honey is mostly made up of fructose and glucose. Honey is about 40% fructose and 30% glucose, with most of the rest being water. Well, unfortunately, most yeast are glucophilic, so they prefer to metabolize glucose over fructose. It's not to say that they won't gobble up that fructose, but they're going to prefer that glucose. If you go have a wine stall out on you, it's usually going to happen when you get really close to that end, when you're only left with really fructose. There are some yeasts that are considered more fructophilic, prefer fructose, like Lalvin EC1118 is one of them, but for the most part, most yeasts are going to be in a little bit of a happier environment if they're in a medium that is a little bit more glucose than fructose versus what we're dealing with this honey. And beyond that, the issue that you can run into is if you have so much sugar that it's putting some osmotic stress on the yeast. So if you get up into 30% sugar by the time you've watered this back, even 32, some people like to make these really, really strong meads, or they want it to stall out with some sugar, but they don't want to cold crash it like I am. Well, there's not a lot of water. If you're 32% sugar, that means you're 68% water, and that can put a little bit of osmotic stress on those cells when they're trying to normalize that environment. It's going to try to suck that water out of those yeast cells, just making them not really happy. Beyond that, the last thing I'll mention is that these honeys can also be a little bit potassium deficient. Now, yeast likes potassium. It can help it ferment, but it's going to probably be fine even if it's a little bit deficient. The main things are going to be really the nutrient, meaning nitrogen mostly, and also the just keeping that pH in check. So let's say you did all these things right. Now let's talk about some other things you can do just to make sure that things go smoothly. Yeast during an active fermentation likes a little bit of air. So what you'll normally do is give it a little bit of a splash or a stir once a day just to give it a little bit of air. You also want to make sure you're working within a temperature window that yeast likes to play in. So if you look up the specs on the yeast that you chose. It'll usually give you a range of temperatures that it works well in. And if you're on the high end of that range, it's usually going to be much less likely to stall versus if you're at the low end of that range. Now in this case, I'm using Lalvin Sensy, which is a low hydrogen sulfide yeast that can ferment all the way down to about 50, I want to say 52 degrees Fahrenheit up into maybe 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Now I'm fermenting it at 64 roughly, partially because that's what's working well in this room, but I do want to lean on the cool side because I want to try to trap a lot of the aromas of that honey. If you ferment hot, you start to blow some of that stuff off. The other thing that happens when you ferment hot is that you're not really getting as many esters from the yeast. So yeast like to produce these kind of fruity esters when they're fermented on the cool end. But if you're using a yeast that is not a low hydrogen sulfide producer, it can also start to produce some of that rotten egg smelling hydrogen sulfide at the cool side. So normally if I'm going to ferment cool, I'm going to choose a yeast that is a low or no hydrogen sulfide producer. I'll put a link to the Sensy that I'm using in the description if you want to try to make a mead like this. Now really that just scratches the surface of what I'm doing with this mead. If you want to learn more, stay tuned. In the next few weeks I'll put a video out where I go into more detail about the things I'm doing to this mead to try to improve mouthfeel, try to make it a really, really high quality product like we do with everything here on the Home Winemaking channel. If you've got more experience with meads and you've got any tips or tricks, I'd love to hear them in the comments below, so feel free to put them there. And if you want to help the Home Winemaking channel, please check out my Patreon page, patreon.com/makewine. Thanks for watching.